Hi, everybody. This is me and my son, Alma. Alma, can you say hi?
Huh?
Alma is 20 years old. He's my son, and he has Down syndrome and autism. And for the past 20 years, we've done all of the things that you're supposed to with speech therapy and ABA therapy and so on. And Alma still has fairly limited speech capabilities. So I just wanted to introduce you to some things about literacy that I've learned about by living with Alma for the last 20 years. So I'm just going to show you what he's looking at right here. These are some of Alma's word cards, and the reason he's playing with those right now is because those have been some of his main toys for the past, probably for about the past 10, 12 years or so. And I'm just going to show you how that kind of came to be. I'm balancing my laptop on my lap while I'm doing this. I'm just going to show you this. So I've just dumped out a whole bunch of animals here, and these are Schleich animals that you can buy at the toy store, and we got these at Jack's Goods. There's a little display with these really high quality little plastic animals. And when Alma was a young kid, he was just totally addicted to these. He loved these toys more than anything and would walk around with them, kind of dancing with them in his hands and playing. So you know that autistic kids often stimulate on specific things over and over again. And these animals, for Alma, like with a lot of other kids with autism, he was really focused on animals as a thing that he wanted to see a lot more of. And so he had, by the time he was about 10 years old, he had just dozens and dozens of these, because every time we went into the Jack's store, he would try to get us to buy some more of them. And he would take these little catalogs that they had for free there over and over again. So, you know, every year we had like 6 or 7 of these free catalogs that they would offer there. And I don't know if any of the other customers ever took any. We think they were mostly just supplying Alma with these catalogs. So by the time he's about 10 years old, I just think, wow, you know, that interest that he has in animals could be an avenue towards teaching him how to read, because that is one of the ABA principles, is that you start teaching autistic kids from where their high interests are. If it's trains, it's trains. If it's elevators, it's elevators. With Alma, it's animals. Disney movies is the thing for a lot of kids with autism. So I just took all of these animals and I made a whole bunch of animal cards. And I thought, okay, we're going to take these animal cards, and then I'm just going to use these with his interest in animals, because he had watched videos and we were constantly talking about the toys, so that he was saying some of the words, making the noises, but his verbalizations were just approximations. So for like cow, he'd say ka, that kind of thing. Goat would be go. And that's how he says it. So we knew that there was receptive stuff going on in his brain, but the expressive piece just wasn't there. And we thought, you know, teaching him how to manipulate printed words could be an avenue towards expression for him, so that he's not just passively receiving the world, but also able to get out there and say things. So I made these word cards for about 6 or 7 of his animals, went downstairs and laminated them, thinking, well, we'll use these as manipulatives over and over again. And then I finished with all of that, and I went upstairs to get something. The cards I had just set down on the table, and I had already laid all of the animals out just like that on the floor. And when I came downstairs, not 4 or 5 minutes later, all of the cards were next to the appropriate animal. And it just blew me away. I thought, oh, he already knew how to read. All of those different things. And it wasn't because somebody had taught him how to read. It was because throughout his life, he had been super interested in animals, and he had been paying attention to what the words were for those, and that it was a visual thing that he was able to associate really quickly with those animals. So I just immediately started printing out all the cards I possibly could of things that he might have already figured out words for. And within about a year, we had strong confidence that he had a reading vocabulary of over 300 words almost before we had even known it. Some of those were probably new for him because I made the cards for them, that he hadn't seen it and remembered it. But it's just this really interesting thing to me that he had this purpose in mind for remembering the words that was completely opaque to us, that we had no idea that it was going on. And that's one of the things that I think the Multiliteracies book coaches us to think about, is what's going on in these people's lives around us that we have no idea about, that we're oblivious to, not just because we might be dealing with disability, but because we're in different cultures, because you and I were raised over here and these students were raised over there, because families are different place to place. They do different things together. They treat each other differently. And all of the interactions that we have with people day to day are kind of guided by those interpersonal interactions. And then those interpersonal interactions are shaped and framed by the institutions, which are shaped and framed by cultural and historical forces that are larger than any one of us tend to have the influence over. So I was blown away by the way my son was able to read, and we still look for little windows into his world. And I'll just show you another one of those windows right now. Similar thing happened to us this year when we went to Disneyland. Alma loves Disney movies, and he's super into Snow White right now. And so it was no surprise to us. I mean, we thought he would probably be really interested in lots of the Disney toys as we walked through the stores on the way out and way in. But the only thing he grabbed that he kind of wanted to take with him, which is his signal that, you know, he wants something to be bought or whatever, was this little pack of 7 dwarfs. I can't get my camera right on it. Little pack of 7 plastic dwarves. And I'll just pull a packet out here for you. They came in this little plastic thing, and we brought them home. And I did the same thing. I printed out the cards thinking, oh, I'm going to teach him how to do these cards. And same thing happened to me again. He just laid down the cards right next to the dwarfs that were already there. And, you know, there are probably a few different ways that he could have learned the names of those dwarfs. But the main one is that the names are all printed on their beds when Snow White sees them all in the movie. And then she says their names. All of the names are said a few different times during the movie. So, you know, how did he learn to associate those printed names with the individual dwarfs? Again, a kind of a vibrant mind going on there that we just get these little glimpses into now and again. And do you think of things like these 7 dwarf toys as literacy? My son does, because we come into the room every now and again and we'll see the dwarfs arranged like this or like this. And what you'll see right here is that often he has one dwarf standing up on a chair and the other dwarfs down on the floor. These are his small pack of dwarfs. And he puts them into these sort of social situations where one is like the boss looking down at everybody, or I don't know, I guess that's my interpretation of it. But there's definitely some sort of grammar of dwarves that's going on here. And we joke in our family, we've been calling this the dwarfocracy for a few weeks now. And I've taken about 150 different pictures since last summer, because every day when we have him pack the dwarfs up and put them away, every day he puts them out in a new tableau, a new setting. And so I take a picture of it, and every now and again I just get out the phone and just flip through those pictures with him just to see what there is. And he'll zoom in on a particular spot and zoom back out because he knows how to do that on his phone. So the purposes are super important. I'm going to just tell a story about a language that I have experience with now. When I was in my early 20s, I had the opportunity to learn to speak Hmong, which is a language from Southeast Asia spoken by Lao refugees who had to leave Laos after the United States lost the botched secret CIA war there in 1975. So we had hundreds of thousands of Hmong people that came to the United States. I worked with groups in Southern California for a couple of years, and Hmong originally was an unwritten language, and there was one script that had been used for a while, since like the 1950s or 60s, that some Lutheran missionaries had come in and introduced, and they just used our Roman script, the alphabet that we use in English, to match up to the Hmong phonemes. And they invented that alphabet so that they could print the Bible and proselyte people to Christianity and so on. By the time I was working with most of these people in the late 1980s, out of the local community of Hmong people was probably about 8,000 or 9,000 people at the time. And there were probably 100, 200 people that could read the Hmong script. So it had made its way through the community of people who saw themselves as Protestant Christians and so on. But even among those people, there was just sort of a small group of, you'd have to call them elites, who could read and write with this script. At the same time, there was a native Hmong guy who had developed a script based on visions that he had had, where his two dead twin sons came back to him in visions and taught him this script that he would deliver to the people and help them become their own people after being kind of pushed around and moved from place to place in other people's nations for thousands of years. China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, the Khmer area, they had constantly been a people without a country and pushed around and marginalized frequently. Still today, a highly marginalized ethnic group inside of mainland China. But what I found was that as much as we tried to help people figure out, well, you could do a lot with your language if you used this script that you have, one or the other of them, just pick one and make it work for you, was that they really had no purpose. There was no thing that they needed to do that would encourage them to write in this script. Many of them who were writing letters still to people back in the refugee camps in Thailand or in the Philippines already knew how to write in Thai or Lao. And they would use their proficiency in this national language that they shared in common to write to someone. And then that person who received the letter would then translate it and speak to all of the other people. And that was the way things were working. The thing that I noticed transformed the Hmong people in terms of them actually adopting an alphabet, a system of writing, is the internet. Once there were chat rooms and MSN Instant Messenger back in the early 2000s, or AOL Instant Messenger, suddenly I started seeing my Hmong friends writing and writing to each other and writing to each other in Hmong. And they were adopting the Protestant missionary script because they had computers with keyboards like this. They didn't have to learn a new alphabet or get a keyboard that had the new alphabet on it, like the native Hmong script would have had them doing. So they ended up drifting towards the one that was the most convenient, and that's what ended up ruling the day. Even deeper and further, Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat have made that completely solid, because a group of Hmong kids in a high school can communicate with each other completely in Hmong if they want to, and communicate with their other friends in English without having to switch devices or apps or anything like that. So the internet completely transformed the capacity for this language to emerge as a written language. And that's the thing that you'll kind of start to see, is that if you look at the New Literacies book, you'll realize that what they're arguing there is that it was never the development of the printing press that changed everything. It was that the printing press enabled all of these functions that society was ready for. So I posted some links in the module that you'll want to look at that just walk you through all of the things, purposes, functions that people started using literacy for in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance ages, that actually shows you that there was a society emerging there that was ready for printed language, and that took it and ran with it. And that's the idea, is that, is there a heart and soul there that's waiting to take this technology and run with it the minute it hits the ground? That happened with the printing press in Europe in the early Renaissance, Middle Ages. And that's kind of the key here as we get into David Olson's book. I want you to be thinking about that. The emergence of print, the history of print is this unique human phenomenon. It has changed us. It has changed the entire humanity, but it's not just the world on paper. Olson kind of hints at this, but the world changed underneath him as he was writing this book in the mid-1990s, to the point where we should really be saying like the world on film, the world on flash drive, the world on phone or whatever, because it's really about media. As soon as you can actually make something permanent and transport it and save it, paper was the original piece, the original medium for that. But he's talking a lot about just the media in general. So a couple of things that I want to show you before I sign off. One is, let's see, the posts that you all put up there last week on Padlet. I liked how a lot of you emphasized the political aspect of what we're talking about here, that identity is a huge issue with literacy, that a lot of who we see ourselves as is tied up in the media that we participate in, the things that we hear, say, and do in media, and participate in. Those things tend to be tied up with who we are. So I'm just going to show you a few things here. One of the key things that I wanted to get to is just the idea that a lot of who we are as people is tied up in images. And so when we're talking about print today, we're not just talking about printed novels and dense text and so on. And I have to say, it's not lost on me, the irony about how we're learning about this by reading a traditional textbook. I get it. If I had some sort of multimedia approach to this that did better than this textbook, I would do it. But it's one of my favorite textbooks right now. I'm glad some of you are responding to it that way. But think about it. This is a whole thing now. When I was a kid, this was the kind of thing your teachers took away from you, and we tried to get as many of these as we could at home and sneak them into school if we could. But we knew our teacher's bottom drawer of her desk was filled with the comic books she had confiscated. But this is now a thing. A generation went by and people said, no, that was reading. That was literacy, and serious people participate in this now, and they give it a fancy name, graphic novels, but the people inside the industry still call it comics. It's librarians and teachers that feel like they have to call it graphic novels so that the parents are okay with it. But these can get shelved in almost exactly the same places, the Garfield books and the Calvin and Hobbes books and the Peanuts books and so on. Picture books have always been that way. Picture books became a real thing that publishers took seriously in the early 20th century. By the mid-20th century, it had really taken off. After World War II, it completely skyrocketed and became this huge thing where school libraries were shelving these and so on. I'm just bringing these titles out quick to show you that the ideas behind social justice and the ideas behind multimodality go together. They're not separated. It's this idea that nothing counts as reading except for a novel and a textbook. That's where the social justice thing comes in. It's a format, it's a mode, and it's something that has been promoted with an agenda that is dominant. So picture books came out and they became a dominant discourse pretty quickly inside of schools, especially when people got really tired of Basils in the mid to late 1980s. There was a huge shift towards children's picture books as the main way of teaching people to read because of the authenticity of it. This is the kind of thing, it's a book. It wasn't written to teach me how to read. It was written to help me have an experience. So a couple of colleagues and I, and a couple of you in the class as graduate assistants, have been working on this project where we've been trying to identify picture books that represent rural life, because we have had this suspicion that there's just not much there on the bookshelf to represent kids who live in rural areas of the United States. And as we've gone through hundreds of these picture books, what we've realized is that inside of the world of picture books, there's a small world of rural America that's being marginalized by publishers. It's much more easy to represent suburban life or urban life for some reason. But rural America is there in picture books, but the bigger question we had is how many picture books can you find that take us into rural America, but then where we're going to see people of different identities represented. And in particular, I picked two where we could see from the covers, it's like the question is, okay, are there any people with brown skin in these picture books? And it's very few. If you find a rural setting, people living on a farm, a quaint little farm, you're not seeing a lot of brown-skinned people. So that's an issue. The social justice issue is big inside of picture books writ large, and the industry has been working on that for like 50 years, probably even more strongly in the past 20 years have been working to make sure that people see themselves inside of the books that they pick up. And that doesn't mean that every picture book has to have a mixture of white and brown and all of this different identity things going on in it. But there should be enough picture books out there that a person who picks up a few picture books can look through them and say, oh yeah, I'm in those as well. If someone thinks that they're in a minority, that there aren't a lot of people out there like them, they should at least see that kind of representation in picture books where they can say, okay, out in the world, I don't see a lot. I may not see everybody that looks like me, but I see some people that looks like me. But for a lot of years, there were almost no people of ethnic people of color in these picture books. And if ethnicity was represented, it was represented as something, overly romantic and so on. Same thing has happened with rural areas, is that we're not only seeing that there's a shortage of diversity inside of the rural picture books, but that many of the picture books represent and show us a romanticized version of rural areas. That typical farm is a red barn with all of the different types of animals all living together under one roof. And the farmer goes out and there's the chicken and there's the duck and there's the horse and there's the cow. And sure, there are places that look like that around the country, but think about what it means to be a farmer today. There's far more of our farmland right now that's farmed by corporations than is the traditional family farm. Do we ever see that in picture books? My dad's a farmer. He works for Monsanto. Is there a picture book about that? There's still got to be a story there, right? But nobody's telling that story. Or my dad was a farmer and we sold the family farm and we moved to the city and now my dad sells insurance or something like that. There are all sorts of different approaches to what stories you could tell about rurality, but we tend to still see for some reason that little red barn off in the middle of Kansas sort of approach to things. So think about that as we look into the world of paper and you start thinking about the history of how literacy has unfolded. I want to encourage you to think beyond just the world on paper that David Olson is talking about and get into the world that we live in today in its full multimodality. I'm showing you things that involve visual images. I'm going to come back to this one again because it will give you a sense for where I'm going to take us in a few weeks. I really want you guys by the end of this course to understand the way that visual grammar works. And this type of approach to things is actually very strongly akin to the idea of storyboarding a movie. A graphic novel is not a bad storyboard for a movie, and storyboarding is one of the 21st century skills. Do we see it as strongly as we need to in school? Do we see projects and outcomes linking up to this idea of storyboarding? One of the reasons that I put this out there is that this is a format and a mode of its own now. The comics are their own thing, but as a storyboard, this is full of scenes and shots. Each one of these panels is a shot, and each setting with its set of shots is a scene. And that's kind of a grammar that we need to be understanding. We need to know how that type of sequential actually works and when it doesn't work, because our kids need to know how to do that. And in doing so, what kinds of stories are they able to tell? Are they able to tell stories that represent themselves and help other people see that this kind of identity is something that I can put out there in digital media, print, whatever modes I decide to choose? So I'm interested in learning what you learn with the books. I know this is a lot of reading, and I appreciate it if you're freaking out a little bit about the amount of reading. I'll just tell you right now, I was a residential graduate student, which meant that I was at school full time. I taught some classes at the university while I was in graduate school, but I still had classes where we read a book a week, and I never finished. I am not that fast of a reader. So if this had been my assignment with the literacies book, and I had 8 chapters to read in 2 weeks, I probably wouldn't have finished each chapter on the day that I had slated to finish it, or I would have gotten to chapter 6 or something like that. Read what you can in the time that we're given. This is good stuff. I tried to pick the best that I could, the most readable that I could, books that weren't written necessarily to be completely academic in nature, not the research papers or the theoretical papers. So do what you can in the 2 weeks. I think you kind of know what I'm hoping for you to get from what I'm telling you here. We want to get to the point where we're able to do projects, the design project at the end of the semester, where we get past all of the reading and we're just digging into the authentic texts and thinking about what could we be doing in education, knowing what we know now. And I'm just going to go ahead and leave it there. I'll talk to you at the end of the week.